All right, so thank you for coming bright and early in the morning. More or less just got off a flight from Sydney, so I'm also feeling a little tired, but it's great to be here. All right, so this is going to be joint work with Gautam and Jojo. We're going to talk about macrofinance, segmentation, and heterogeneity. It's really going to try to bring distributions into what you've been looking at so far in this course. That's really the aim. Okay. So the starting point from this project was the observation that historically governments have created very different looking financial sectors. If we take the US as an example, if we think back in the pre-FDR era, we really had a world where banks were largely very restricted in what they could do. They basically make short-term commercial paper loans and hold US debt, and it's the insurance companies that took on the mortgages and a lot of the risk. Right? FDR completely reorganizes the whole financial sector and introduces a system where it's actually the banks that are going to take on a lot of the long-term risky assets, and the insurance companies increasingly are expected to match duration in their asset holdings. So we have very different financial sectors. We also have a lot of evidence that the way you organize the financial sector and what kinds of constraints you put on different financial intermediaries has a big impact on asset pricing. I'm thinking here a lot of the work of Moto and many others, showing that when you place certain kinds of restrictions, you get very particular kinds of over or under reaction in prices in response to shocks. So we know all of this, we know it's important, and there's been a lot of interest in trying to understand how all this action in the organization of the financial sector, all this action in the asset markets, how does this all end up feeding through to households and their welfare? This is a good and important question, but it's technically been very challenging. Because to answer it, we need to think about a macro model that has rich asset pricing, rich heterogeneity, and this is a complicated thing to try to work with. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to try to persuade you that Gautam and I and Jojo have made significant progress on trying to get to terms with the technical issues here, and then come back and try to answer these questions. Okay. But let me open with a question for you guys, right? We've seen these very different organizations in terms of which types of markets different financial intermediaries can participate in. As an opening question for you guys, what do you think? If a regulator came to you and said, should all financial intermediaries be able to participate in all asset markets, what would your answer be? And who do you think would gain and lose from the way you restrict these asset markets? Any opening thoughts? Or is it too early in the morning?
I guess part of it depends on what outcome you want to achieve. Like say, if you are in emerging market economy, you might want to have some kind of capital controls so that there is not too much capital in and out.
Okay, so you think about international dimension, you're concerned about capital flowing in and out.
And
okay.
Also sometimes there is also government rent extraction, so you might want to have some kind of control over who participates in what.
You might want to inflate government debt prices, for example.
Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense.
Studying theory, I want to say yes. Studying practical things, I want to say no. So the way I would reconcile the two is maybe there are gains from specialization. So then you want to have segmented markets, just people handling risky assets versus just deposits.
Okay, I think that's reasonable as well. Neither of them are quite the direction we're going to go in, but they're pretty good answers to the question. Oh, another one, another candidate. Go for it.
Yes. And also in terms of risk taking, like how risky can your asset be or all of your balance sheets? Like, I don't think like banks should be allowed to participate in highly risky financial asset markets.
It's going to be a basic question, right? I mean, which intermediaries are best placed to take on what sort of risk, right? I guess that's these segmentation questions usually come down to this kind of issue, right? Do you want to restrict the risk taking or not? Is the liability structure of particular intermediaries well suited to handling certain kinds of risk or not? And do they take on too much or too little? I think in that sense, I agree. But we want to try to play out here what is the impact across the household distribution when we do that. Okay, so we'll come back, don't worry. All right, so the way I'm going to do this, it's going to take us a little while to get back to this question, but we will at the end, okay? So this is a somewhat technical conference, so I'm going to do it as a technical talk. So I'm going to start with an illustrative model. So I'm going to think about a heterogeneous agent macrofinance model. This literature likes acronyms, so it's HAMP short. So we'll start with a HAMP model, which is really the kind of models you've been doing thus far in the past couple of days, but with a distribution of households. Okay? I'll show you how we can actually solve these models when you have a distribution of households. And I'll use this to illustrate the technical side. And a lot of the emphasis is going to be how can we use these deep learning tools that I think you did a little bit of in the past couple of days. Is that right, Gautam? Have they seen it? Not this year. Oh, okay. What happened? Okay. So you haven't seen it yet, but we'll talk a little bit about how we can use deep learning to sort of open up what we can solve. And then the second model we'll do, we'll take these tools and then we'll try to think in more detail about an institutional asset pricing model that can actually get back to the initial question that I posed at the start. Does this make sense? Are you excited? Okay. In terms of the literature, I mean, what I really work on is trying to think through this design of the financial sector. I think about it in a range of contexts in terms of how you can finance the government. Here it's really going to be about inequality, who wins and who loses from the way you set up the financial sector. That's very much what my research focuses on. I think the goal here is to bring together macro financial design with distributional outcomes. Okay. In terms of the outline of the talk, so I'll go through this illustrative model and we'll set it up. Then we'll talk about how we can train a neural network or solve a neural network to learn the equilibrium. Then we'll talk a little bit about what we can learn about inequality and asset price dynamics in our basic model, and then we'll get to the institutional asset pricing question. Okay, that's the outline. All right, so let's start with the model. Okay, as I said, it's intended to be a heterogeneous agent version of the kind of models you've been doing thus far. So you might not be surprised to learn it's continuous time, infinite horizon. There's one good produced by an AK production technology where output is equal to e to the z times k, where z here is the productivity, and that's going to be the aggregate shock process for the economy. So the productivity is going to follow a mean reverting process with some shocks, sigma, subject to this Brownian motion. As in many of the models you've seen, you can invest in capital stock, but there is some investment cost. So if you invest at a rate iota, what you get is an increase in the capital stock of phi iota. Okay? Same kind of model as you've had. The economy is going to be populated by two types of agents. There are going to be households, and these households are going to have an OLG style structure. So they're born, they eat, and then they're going to die stochastically. And the death rate is going to be lambda h. And when a new agent is born, they're going to be born with some wealth A that's drawn from some distribution that has some mean that is proportional to the aggregate wealth in the economy. This capital A is just the aggregate wealth in the economy. While they're alive, the households get a flow utility, a CRA utility, from consuming some amount C. The big friction that's going to sit on these households is it's not so easy for them to hold the capital directly. So there's going to be a penalty on holding capital, where the penalty is higher the more capital you hold, and lower the more wealth you have. Right? This is our way of mimicking a world where there are fixed costs or behavioral constraints with investing in capital stock, so the wealthier agents are more able to take it on. And this is ultimately what's going to mean we're going to be able to match the feature of the data that wealthy agents are going to hold more of their wealth in capital or equities, if you prefer. Yes, go for it.
Why is the total wealth of the economy fixed? A, big A, why is it constant?
I don't mean it to be constant, yeah. So there will be a T subscript on here. The total wealth is moving around. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's the household side. Then there's going to be a collection of experts. So we're not going to get aggregation amongst the households due to this capital holding penalty, but we will get aggregation amongst the financial experts. The financial experts are fairly plain vanilla. They also die at some rate lambda e. They're replaced by new experts. They have log preferences. They are the ones that issue the instantaneous risk-free bonds, and they can hold the capital without penalty. All right, so that's the setup. Does this make sense?
What did you mean by you don't have a relation, you do have a relation?
I don't have a relation, you do have a relation.
What did you mean when you said that you have a relation with experts, but you didn't have a relation?
So we've got a continuum of each. The households, we're going to need to keep track of a distribution of them, whereas for the financial experts, we're not going to. And when you see the optimization problem, we'll come back and think about why. Okay. Okay. Yes, go.
Are there any switching between, say, household and expert?
No switching. Yeah, these are permanent type differences. Okay. So we can complete the environment. So we have that agents are dying and being reborn. So there has to be some kind of transfer process in the background that's going to give the wealth to the new agents coming in. So we're going to model that by a flow wealth tax that's going to finance these transfers to new agents. So we'll let tau j be the end transfer that is placed on either households or experts as a fraction of their wealth. So if we let capital A be the wealth of a particular sector, either the household sector or the expert sector, and we let this A be the total wealth, then we have this budget constraint for the tax transfer process where the total wealth coming in through the taxes and the wealth of people dying has to be equal to the new transfers. And going back to your question, I haven't put T subscripts here, but there are T subscripts on the A's. Yeah. Okay, so this is the tax and transfer process going on in the background to get this distribution to add up. And then finally, we have to say something about the markets. So there are a few different markets here. There's a market for goods. There's a market for these short-term bonds being issued by the experts. And there's a market for capital. Okay, I'm going to use R for the risk-free rate, Q for the capital price, and R for the return on capital. And this process looks the same as you've seen the past couple of days, where I'm going to use mu for the drift and sigma for the volatility. Okay. So I think you can see straight away the two big frictions on this asset market are that they're incomplete in two important ways. One is that the households cannot contract across generations. They cannot write insurance contracts with each other that way. And then the experts are not going to be able to raise equity, right? So there's no way for them to raise equity to rebalance their position, same as you've seen in most of the models the past couple of days. That's the whole environment. Does this make sense to everyone? Would you agree this is really taking what you've seen for the past couple of days and putting a distribution of households into it? Is that fair? No, Marcus, you disagree.
I agree, but the experts who split them up between banks and insurance companies?
I'm going to go through the model without that, and then at the end we can come to this model. And ultimately, insurance companies are going to help insure across the generations, and the banks are going to help raise issue deposits. But to save some hassle with the maths, we're going to go through the simpler one first.
Okay, so the heterogeneity from households comes from that, or also comes from idiosyncratic?
So it comes from, yes, so it comes from the fact they're dying stochastically at different rates, and then if you have different wealth, you're going to make different portfolio choices, right? And that's
kind of a differences in the initial level of capital and assets generate this heterogeneity. It's not idiosyncratic shocks.
There's no idiosyncratic labor shocks. There's no Bewley model, or I guess idiosyncratic capital shocks. There's idiosyncratic death shocks, and that's going to fan out the distribution in conjunction with this constraint. So it is an OLG model, right? OLG models have heterogeneity essentially across generations. That's what you have here.
But the static distribution stays the same, right, over time?
What do you mean by the
Like
static?
snapshot of distribution each time is same. Snapshot of the distribution, like.
I mean, if you said the distribution in terms of age, yes. The distribution in terms of A's, not necessarily, right? Because that's going to be hit by this aggregate shock process.
Also, aggregate wealth across sectors will be different.
Yes, because we have risk in the capital prices, right? So as aggregate shocks hit, it's going to move it around. That's going to mean both the distribution of wealth amongst households and the wealth between sectors is going to move around. Marcus, you had your hand up now?
You consume everything you would have left?
In this one here, it's passed on to the next generation, right? But we'll get to this consumption at terminal in the extension. Yes, Jan.
So the difference is like, say like if I'm the guy who's been around for like 500 years, I will be different also in terms of like aggregate shocks that I lived through. And that's also one reason why I will have a different assets than somebody who went through, say, shorter or longer history. no idiosyncratic risk except the length of my life. The length of my life implies different aggregate history average.
That's correct, yeah. So it's very much a model about hysteresis in the wealth distribution, right? When you see inequality, to what extent does that inequality get propagated or not propagated by the asset market, right? So if I see a whole lot of inequality today, this is going to be a model where the distribution may have a tail because the agents that are wealthy have better opportunities. So the rich get richer. Right?
That's why you need to use tax and transfer to keep the distribution from line.
Yes, that's what keeps it stationary. Yep, 100%.
Can you go back to the expression here for the return on capital? In the numerator, do we have a EC times KT, or it's just EC?
This is a return on buying the capital. So this is like I buy capital for this price. This is the flow output I get.
And should it be KT?
I think I'm missing a KT there.
Okay,
Yep,
that is-
that's fair.
okay.
Yep. Yep, fair enough. Yep. Or you could take the K out of the bottom and take the K out of there.
Yeah, okay.
So the bequest from the older generation to the young is randomly drawn from the distribution.
That's correct. With a mean that is proportional to the aggregate wealth in the economy. Why do I draw from a distribution rather than just saying everybody gets this?
So you idiosyncrasies.
Well, I'm concerned about mass points in the distribution, right? So if everybody enters at exactly the same point, then I don't have a well-defined density. I'm going to have a mass point somewhere in the density, and then I'm going to have to work with a different solution concept. So I want to smooth out where people enter, so my KFE has a full solution. I don't have to go for a weak solution to the KFE. Okay. All right. Great questions, I think. You're very lively for the morning on the final day. Last couple of times I've had the final slot, Marcus, and it's much more lively in the morning. This is okay. All right. So let's think about the problems. Okay. So given a belief about the price process, a household I with wealth AI, where their wealth is their holdings of bonds issued by the experts and capital, they're going to solve this problem here. They need to choose consumption, they choose their capital holdings, they choose their investment rate. They get utility from consumption, they get this disutility from holding capital, depending on their wealth, and then we get a very standard looking evolution of their wealth, where we have the fraction that they hold in bonds times the return on bonds plus the fraction they hold in capital times return on capital. Okay, so standard looking budget constraint. As I think's been standard here, I'm going to use the mu for the geometric drift and the sigma for the geometric volatility, and the AI indicates it for the household. Okay. The expert problem is very similar, but they don't have the psi. Okay. So my claim is going to be that within the expert sector, we're going to get aggregation. Right? We could essentially represent this continuum of experts by one pseudo-representative expert. But for the households, we're going to have to keep track of the distribution. So you've asked this question a few times, so maybe you can answer it now. So why for the experts would we be able to represent this, do you think, by a pseudo-representative expert?
Because you have the low utility that allows you to have low consumption rules.
Yeah.
And that allows variation.
So my wealth is going to scale with A, right? So my wealth scales with A, and I've got just one log utility here. So I'm going to be able to guess and verify a solution for the value function of the HJB, and I'm going to see that all agents are going to make the same portfolio choice. That's the key thing, right? The key thing to get the aggregation here is every agent in the expert sector is going to choose the same C, the same K, and the same iota. That's why we can aggregate. Why do we not have that for the households?
Because psi breaks homotheticity.
Exactly, because the psi breaks the homotheticity, so that we mean that the wealthy agents are going to choose more capital than the poor agents, right? This is why I've introduced it. And this is also the key feature in the data. When you look at the data, it's not true that the wealthiest agents in the economy hold the same fraction of deposits and the same fraction of equity as the poorest agents in the economy. You see a very big distribution, a very big difference in the portfolios that poorer and wealthy agents hold. And we're going to get that through the psi. And that's what means we're not going to be able to aggregate inside the household sector. Does this make sense?
sorry for being that guy, but why do you have FCs there? Like, as an example.
So legacy, I think at some point, my experience with macrofinance is when people are working on macrofinance, they always say, I'm not going to start with Epstein's in, and then at some point they come back and say, well, I had to try Epstein's in for X reason, usually to get risk premia. We did try it, but there's no particular need here. Yeah. All right. So equilibrium here is going to look very standard, right? So for a given set of government taxation policies, the equilibrium is a collection of processes for capital and the prices, such that all the households in the economy make their decisions, and then the representative financial intermediary is going to make their decision, or representative expert. Given the beliefs, the households optimize and the experts optimize. And then we have a whole stack of clearing conditions, clearing in the goods market. So the consumption in the household sector and the expert sector adds up to total production. Capital market clearing, bond market clearing. And then in the end, the agent's beliefs have to be consistent with the prices that emerge. This is the rational expectations part of the assumption. So standard looking equilibrium. Okay. So that's the setup. We need to think about how we're going to make progress in solving it. Okay. So we found it helpful to write this in terms of a collection of 3 blocks. We've talked about, but to do that, we first need to talk about the state space. So as we just mentioned, we're going to get aggregation within the expert sector, but not within the household sector. We're going to have to keep track of a distribution of households. So our state space is going to look like the following. The individual household state is their individual wealth. The aggregate states are going to be the TFP, Z, the aggregate capital stock, K, and then this G, where G is the measure of household wealth at point A. Okay? So G is the quote-unquote distribution across households for this economy. In the end, if we know the K and the G, we can infer the expert sector wealth as a residual. And the key thing here is that ultimately prices are going to be a function of G, so agents' beliefs about the price process essentially become beliefs about the evolution of G. Okay? So that's our state space. Aggregate state space, Z, K, and this pesky distribution G. We're going to divide this up into 3 blocks. Block 1 is the evolution of the distribution. Block 2 is the way agents optimize. Block 3 is equilibrium consistency. Okay? So let's talk through each of these blocks.
Sorry, I think I missed it. So the household wealth, GT, is hit by idiosyncratic shocks happening.
There is a population of households, and the households are dying. And when they die, their wealth goes back into the pool and a new household comes in. And this idiosyncratic generational risk is what opens up this distribution. Does that make sense?
And initial idiosyncratic wealth drop.
Yes, sure. And the wealth, yeah, that's fair as well. Yeah. Okay. So first thing we need to think about is how does this distribution evolve? Okay. So individual state is A. We need to get this evolution of G. So I claim that the evolution of G is going to look like the following. This is a so-called Kolmogorov-Forward equation, which is just a fancy term for the way the distribution evolves. And this has a few different components. We have the birth and the death. Okay. So we have agents dying at rate lambda, in which case they exit the distribution. We lose mass at A. We also have birth, and the A's are drawn from some density var phi check. Okay, this is your randomness there, right? So people are entering at different points. Then we have the wealth drift. So the wealth is drifting at mu A, and that enters into this second point, second term of the KFE. Then we have the wealth volatility, with the fact that there's noise in the asset prices, and that's going to feed through into shocks to the wealth. And then finally, we have this extra term where the whole distribution is being hit by the DW. Okay, this is what the KFE looks like. Question for you guys. If you had the problem and you were going to derive a KFE, how would you go about doing it? And the answer should not be because Jonathan said so. The answer should be mathematical. So if you just had an arbitrary problem and you were trying to get your own KFE, how would you step through it? How would you start approaching that? Any thoughts? Have you done KFEs yet so far? Okay.
I think we can use the M matrix, or maybe the transpose, I think. Well, I think we saw that in a class.
The M transpose, I think you have in mind that you'd put it on a grid in some sense, and then once you've discretized on the grid, there is this adjoint property between the HJB matrix and the KFE matrix, thinking about Ben Moll's appendix, page 16, or something like that. Is that what you have in mind? There was another comment down here.
Yeah, if it is slightly too big, but you can derive it with lemma.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly how we're going to do it. Right? So the way I like to derive these KFEs is this so-called propagation of chaos argument, right? Which is where you start with a finite agent population, and then you take the limit as the number of agents goes to a continuum. And this often shows you very clearly where you should expect to see noise and not expect to see noise in the Kolmogorov-Forward equation. So I'm going to sketch through this in 2 slides, and you can take it away for homework if you would like to fill in the gaps. Okay? And it's going to be essentially Ito's lemma. Right? So the idea is we're going to study the dynamics of a finite agent population, then take the limit. So let's start with that. So suppose we have a population with n agents. They all have individual wealth. The wealth is going to follow an equation. So we've got the drift of their wealth. Then we've got whatever the exposure of their wealth is to the aggregate TFP shocks in the economy. That's the DW part. Okay. We need to think about birth and death. So I'm going to use dn as the indicator for the plus-on event that the death happens. So for agent I, they could die. The dn indicates when that is 1, that indicates the death has happened, in which case the wealth disappears, but they get a draw of new wealth, A hat, okay, or A check. Then we also need to adjust a little bit for the taxes, because the way we defined mu actually had the taxes in it, but here the taxes are stochastic. When someone dies, you make the tax payment. We need an extra adjustment term, but I'm not going to focus on that. I want to focus on the other parts. Okay. So this is how the wealth of an individual agent is going to evolve. We can then define the empirical density function. So if we think about this finite population, we can say the empirical density, g hat n, that is essentially 1 over the sum of indicator functions, or Dirac delta measures, for the positions of each of the agents. Right? So this is just the counting measure. We're just saying count up where the agents are, form the empirical histogram, and that's the empirical density function for the economy. So we've got a finite agent population. We've got the empirical density for the finite agent population. Now what we want to do is we want to apply Ito's lemma to it, exactly like, I can't see your name. Valentin, exactly like Valentin suggested. The difficulty is, though, that it's not easy to apply Ito's lemma to an indicator function. Right? So what's the trick we always use when we want to apply Ito's lemma, but we have an indicator function? Well, we use a so-called test function and apply it to the test function, then use integration by parts to get it back again. Okay? So we'd like to use Ito's lemma on this thing. We can't because this Dirac delta is difficult. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to apply Ito's lemma not to the sum of the indicator functions, but to the sum of some function phi of the positions of the agents, where phi is an arbitrary, smooth, compact function, often called a test function in the literature. Does this make sense?
Can I ask why can't we use the other technique here? What is the problem?
I don't know which other technique.
We talk about BAMOs, just driving pulses and merging them.
Well, that's not actually a derivation, though. So yes, okay. There is a class of problems for which you can show that there is this adjoint relationship between these two operators. It won't be a matrix per se, because the matrix comes in the numerical discretization. Okay. What we want is some way to look at an economy and be able to write down the KFE. And if you wanted to prove results about the adjoint, you would still need some way of getting the KFE to prove the results about the adjoint. Right? For starters, in that appendix, there's no example with an aggregate shock, a DW. Right? So it's not at all clear what the adjoint looks like there. So to get the adjoint, you'd have to write down the stochastic HJB. So yes, there are a whole bunch of papers on stochastic HJBs and stochastic HJB adjoints. That's a complicated business. We end up with this complicated term, because that's a partially recursive representation, where you want to say V is a function of the individual state, but then we're going to leave the aggregate states implicit and have that stochastic, and then somehow we have to get that. But that adjoint has these unknown components, so you don't get a nice closed form for that HJB. That's kind of the difficulty we're trying to go that route. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we can apply Ito's lemma. So we apply Ito's lemma to phi. We get the following. Okay, so this is the change in phi of A from time 0 to time t. This is our standard Ito's lemma for the different terms. This is our jump term, right? So agents get these idiosyncratic shocks, di, and when they do, the wealth jumps from A to wherever you come in when you're reborn. Okay. Then we have this extra term for the dwz, plus we got these tax and transfer terms. Okay. Just standard application of Ito's lemma. The thing I want to highlight, though, is we see in this straight away what happens for the aggregate shock term, this dwz, and what happens for these idiosyncratic shock terms. Right? So if we think about the law of motion for the wealth of an agent, some of it is just aggregate noise. Right? There is a TFP shock in the economy that changes asset prices, that changes agents' wealth. That's this term here. But there's also idiosyncratic noise for when the agents die and are reborn. Right? One of them is going to average out, the idiosyncratic one. The aggregate one is not. And we can see that when we take the limit in this arrangement here. So when we take the limit as the number of agents goes to infinity, all this idiosyncratic noise averages away. And so what we end up with here is not the dni, this Poisson shock for when agents die. Instead, we just get the rate lambda h at which agents die. But for this TFP noise, right, this dw shock, that stays there. And that's the part that makes the distribution stochastic. So I don't know what your name was, but oh yeah, okay, Bijoy. So you asked, is the evolution of G constant, right? So no. So not only is it not constant in the sense that it's drifting, right? It might drift around over time, but it also has this noise. The aggregate shocks hit the prices, they hit the wealth, and that moves it around. And actually, we have a very clean characterization of the way in which the aggregate noise in the economy is moving G around and making it a stochastic evolution of the distribution. Does this make sense? Oh, right up the back.
Maybe it's a bit of a naive question, but can you just take the limit there? I mean, like you're just going with like a finite n, taking the limit, and then ending up at a continuum, right? And that's kind of maybe that's totally.
I didn't hear the first part. You're saying how do you take that limit? Or?
No, how do you like? I mean, you would end up as like with a countable set, like at least with a countable set, right? But like you're.
Oh, you're asking what it means to take the limit as I go from a finite population to an infinite population.
No, to an uncountable population.
Right. But so what you're doing is you're normalizing, right? So you should think of it as there's a collection of agents, and yes, there's a finite collection of agents n, but each agent has a mass 1 over n. And so when you take the limit, yes, you're getting an infinite number of agents, but the mass of each agent is infinitely small. And you have to do both things at the same time. And that's how you take all the limits in this literature. Does that make sense? So you have to both increase the number of agents and decrease the mass per agent in the economy. So you keep it at a continuum. You want to have a unit measure 1 of agents as you take this limit. Does that make sense? If you didn't divide by n, everything would explode, right? If you didn't do that in your empirical density. Was that your question? Okay, great.
Given that aggregate capital is a state function, when we apply this lemma, we do it with 2 dimensions, or we're considering one here?
Great question. So that's embedded in the t, right? So here I've got the density as a function of t, and this t is hiding all the sins. Whenever you have a t subscript, that is capturing all the aggregate state variables that are not sort of being explicitly put there, right? So this gt is moving around, so it's g as a function of time. If I was going to try to think about the recursive path for the economy, then I would need to know the initial g, the initial k, and if I knew the sequence of shocks, I could get the g at time t as a function of the path of k and the path of g. But the t subscript here is embodying that. Does that make sense? All right, these are, all right. Okay, so we can get to the second block, which is the agent optimization. Okay, so first block, the KFE. Second block, this is very standard. There's an individual state for the households, their wealth, the aggregate state, which I'm going to call S. Given their beliefs, the agents are going to choose the consumption, the iota, and I'm going to denote their capital choice by their wealth share, so the QK divided by their wealth, so the fraction of their wealth they put into capital rather than bonds, and we get a standard looking equation, except for these pesky green terms, right? So when we think about agent optimization, we have to think about how the evolution of the distribution is going to end up affecting the value function of the agents. That's what's in this green term here. This is what's plagued so many macroeconomists. How do we make progress on trying to get the interaction between the way G moves and the way the value function of the agent changes? Okay. The expert HJB is similar. It's with log utility, or if you want to have with Epstein's in, then it's going to look Epstein's in-ish, if you so desire. And then the key thing is in equilibrium, the beliefs are consistent. So the agent beliefs about the way the distribution is evolving are consistent with what happens in the economy. Okay, so it's a very standard looking HJB, except for the fact that somehow we're trying to deal with the whole distribution interaction or effect on V, and that's where we need to make some progress. Yes?
Why does this psi function depend on the aggregate state? I thought it only depended on decisions.
Well, that's fair. So I think I wrote it initially with a T subscript, but in practice, you're right. We actually take the S out, and it's really just a function of theta and A, right? Yeah, that's unnecessary generality.
So here we are assuming the birth and death process in the request rather than independent from the productivity shocks.
100%, yeah, yep. The demographic changes are independent of productivity. Although you could redo this if they interacted, right? It would not be so difficult to do that. Okay. And then finally, we have the clearing conditions. And of course, as is standard in all these models, we know that the Q has to adjust to clear the capital market, but we don't know how to impose it explicitly, right? We don't have an explicit function of Q of the distribution. All we have is this implicit connection that when I apply Ito's lemma to the process for Q, it has to line up with my guess of my mu Q and my sigma Q. Yes?
So basically, this PE that you get in the second line, the next one, that this implicit condition on the Q encapsulates all the market clearing conditions, or you need to impose both of them separately.
Well, the Q is the one that's hard to get, right?
Yes.
So the long duration assets, so the short-term assets, as you know well, are easier to work with. Here we have one long-term asset, that's the capital. And the capital stock is the asset for which the price process has an implicit connection to the distribution in the economy, captured by Ito's lemma. Same as in all the classes you've done, you've always ended up with this differential equation for the evolution of the price, or for the price function. That's coming from the fact that you can't get it explicitly out of the clearing condition. You only know that implicitly it has to satisfy the clearing condition. But for the R, it's easier to see. You can get explicitly for the R.
Yeah, because like in discrete time, what I would usually get is, okay, there is a market clearing condition I need to satisfy, and then condition of this price shows in Euler equations of agents, right? So I need to jointly solve Euler equation and market clearing condition. But here there is this additional condition showing out.
No, it's really the same condition, but written in continuous time, right? So you could write the discrete time a similar way. You could say there are a series of shocks epsilon, right? And you could say I'm going to guess that my price process evolves with the shocks. And I'm going to guess that there is a drift term and there is an exposure term to whatever epsilon is going to hit me in discrete time. And I could say I start by assuming I have some mu and I have some sigma exposure to the epsilon shocks. I trace it all through, and then I would need to have some consistency. That in the end, if I think about the function Q as a function of the states, and I do some kind of expansion of that, it would have to be consistent with the process I guessed. I could go through the same steps, but it's particularly natural to do that in continuous time because we have this Ito's lemma that says if I guess that there is this functional form for the stochastic process for Q, I can then link it through derivatives to this function of the state very cleanly at the end. In discrete time, we don't have as nice an Ito's lemma, so it's much harder to organize it this way.
Okay, let's do.
Okay, I was wildly optimistic about how many slides I was going to get through, but that's fine. It's good to.
The term partial V, partial T, I don't see it.
Partial V, partial T. Why would I have a partial T?
I mean, isn't that a typical term in a time varying HJV and a time varying value function?
Well, there's.
Partial V, partial
Oh, I see. So good question. So there's two ways to set up HJBs, right? One way is to set it up partially recursively, where I say V is a function of the idiosyncratic state and has a T subscript. The other option is to set it up fully recursively, where we say there's a full state vector and I'm putting it in. And if I do it fully recursively, I should not see a T subscript anywhere, because I put in all the states, right? It's a fully recursive specification of the problem. But then I have the headache that I have to have these green terms. These green terms are saying, well, if G changes, how does V change, right? So that's my trade-off. Either I can have a derivative with respect to T that I can never solve for, I don't know what to do with, or I can write it as a function of the full state space where I get a term I understand, but it's a very high dimensional term. We're going to go the latter approach.
Why do we have only one cross partial?
What do you mean by only one?
Which is...
Why don't we have it for capital?
Yeah.
Because the evolution of capital is not stochastic. Because we do not have an aggregate shock hitting capital stock. So we have an aggregate TFP shock that changes the productivity of capital, but there is no stochastic depreciation. So if we think about the models you've been doing, you probably had a stochastic depreciation where this delta was stochastic. Sometimes you had a lot of depreciation, sometimes you had little depreciation. But here, depreciation is constant. So the evolution of K is non-stochastic, but the productivity of capital is stochastic. I want that because I want a mean reverting process. I want to have predictable mean reversion. I want to be able to link it to TFP. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So why is this hard to solve? All right, so let's just sort of place it in context, the different models, and explain why this is a tricky system with these three blocks. So I've got one block, which is the distribution evolution, one is optimization, and the other is this asset pricing. So if we think about a representative agent economy, if I think about like a Lucas asset pricing model, 1978, there's a representative household, so there's no distribution to worry about. Okay? That means I can always just say consumption is equal to output. I can sub that in, and life gets a lot simpler. I do potentially have to solve for Q, though. I could take a step in a different direction, and I could think about something like Crusoe-Smith, right? Where I have idiosyncratic labor shocks. So I have a distribution that emerges, but I only have short-term assets. I have a rental rate on capital, and I have a bond rate. So we don't have this complicated long-term asset price Q that makes it hard to work out how to get the prices, right? For Crusoe-Smith, we can always express the rental rate and the interest rate explicitly as functions of the distribution. So we don't have to worry about this third part. Okay? We can go out of the direction. We can think about the kind of models you've been doing, Marcus's models. So here we only have two agents, right? We've got an expert, a non-expert, or if we have multiple agents, there's an aggregation result in the household sector. So our distribution is low dimensional. We can summarize it with one state variable, an eta, right? So we have a low dimensional distribution to worry about, but we have to handle the complicated asset pricing because we do have long-term prices. The technical difficulty here is this model, even in this simplified form that I'm showing you, it has all three, right? It has a complicated distribution of households. It has complicated optimization. We don't get a closed form solution to the optimization problem, right? And we have to deal with long-term asset pricing, right? So we have to deal with all the difficulties you would get in a macrofinance model. This is why we think that having solved this gives you the template for trying to open up the range of macrofinance models that you can deal with. Does this make sense?
I was wondering, did you think about in the Smith model traditionally you just use a few wealth moments inside the whole distribution? Did you also think about a solution like that, or where you go with that?
In this paper, we have not thought about that issue. I have, I guess, 3 papers on these deep learning topics. I guess the search one is the one where we think the most about that issue, because the search is where it's sort of hardest to try to get something like that. but no, we've not tried a comparison with the summary moment like in Crusoe-Smith. I can't speak to how well that would go. Okay. All right. So we want to try to use a neural network to get a handle on this. Okay. So the high-level idea is we replace the agent continuum by some high but finite dimensional approximation of the distribution. If you like, Crusoe-Smith is a one-dimensional approximation. We want to open up what we can think about. Do I want to answer that? I'm going to leave that question because I'm running out of time. Okay, yeah, I was about to give a different answer, but I'll continue. Okay. Then we want to represent the key equilibrium functions by neural networks with the states as inputs. Okay, so we want to take all these functions we need, represent them by neural networks, and then we want to find a way to find or train the neural network parameters to get parameters that minimizes the loss in the equilibrium conditions. Right? In this sense, we can find a good representation of the equilibrium in terms of these neural network parameterizations. Okay. When we say it like that, it's relatively straightforward to describe. It's kind of tricky to implement in practice. It's not so easy to do. And I guess part of the art here is trying to work out how to write the problem and help the neural network to learn. Okay. So let's start with the first question. How might we think about trying to approximate the distribution here? So there's three main options we've thought about. One is to work with a finite population. So we work with many agents. If we have a finite population of agents, and the KFE is the evolution of the positions of all these different agents. We could discretize, so we could think about the asset space, so the wealth of the agents. We could put the wealth of the agents on a grid, and then the evolution of the distribution would be masses between the different grid points, or the evolution of mass between the different grid points. Or we could think about projection, right? So we could think about a set of basis functions and then projecting onto the set of basis functions. And then the evolution of the distribution would be keeping track of these projection coefficients. So there's a paper where we actually compare the different approximations in a range of models from Crusoe-Smith through to a spatial model and think about what kind of works best in what context. For this talk and in this paper, we use the finite population approximation. So we're going to work with a finite number of agents. You might think, if you just thought about this for a second, you might think that you're going to need thousands and thousands of agents to do this, which would make this very difficult. But actually we're not, right? In the problems we work with, we use a relatively small number of agents, but we nonetheless we're able to get a good representation of the equilibrium. Okay. I guess I'm running a bit out of time, right, Marcus? I have 7 minutes, is that right? 10? I think 7, okay. Okay, so I'll just make one comment here that the reason we can work with this finite approximation, so the reason why people normally think that having a small number of agents is a problem is they're concerned about idiosyncratic noise, right? If I have only a finite population, we kind of want this idiosyncratic noise to average out, but with a small number of agents it's hard to do that. But we get around this problem in a number of ways. When we think about training the model and we think about agents forecasting, we actually have agents forecasting where we've averaged over the idiosyncratic noise. So if you think about that limit we talked about earlier, what we're really doing is we're taking the limit and averaging out the idiosyncratic noise, but we're not averaging out the rest of the finite agent population. So it's a little bit like a selective limit, right? Where we're going to average out the idiosyncratic noise here, but we're going to allow for n agents in the rest of it, okay? Then when we actually do simulation, right? When we do simulation, we don't work with the n-agent system for the simulation. We actually use the solution with n agents to approximate the KFE on a grid and work with that KFE. Right? So this really means that we can detach the dimension that's required for trying to train the model and work out the pricing functions from trying to get an accurate simulation or trying to get inside the model forecasts that average out the idiosyncratic noise. Okay. A second thing we think about is what are the equilibrium conditions that we're going to end up with in this finite agent approximation. So we can change the state space a little bit. So we're going to rewrite the problem. We actually always use the derivative of the value function rather than the value function. So instead of solving for v, we solve for the derivative of v with respect to a, or if you like, the normalized SDF. Okay. And then we're going to work with these finite wealth shares, right? So instead of working with this continuum or this density, we work with the wealth shares for the finite agents. So really our aggregate states become Z, K, and then the wealth shares of all the agents. Once equilibrium's imposed, we know that all these functions, xi, all the rest of the functions, they're functions of this aggregate state space. So we solve for that directly. And again, we could group the resulting equations into the 3 blocks: the distribution evolution, the optimization, and the consistency. I'm not going to go through them all again, except just to highlight that once we have this finite agent approximation, our KFE becomes, our HJB becomes high dimensional, but a little bit more manageable. So going back to your question, right? Again, we do not have the T subscript on the V. We're going to need to take derivatives with respect to the whole distribution. But now the whole distribution is the positions of these n agents. And so we end up with a sum over the positions of all these different agents. And that's what appears in these green terms for trying to approximate the way that the distribution affects the value function. Okay? So it becomes a finite but high-dimensional problem to try to work with. Yes?
So we are using discretization here. So how is the method different from the discrete? Because the discrete time model also uses discretization on the state variable.
How is it difficult to... That might be too big a question for the... okay, I'll say in brief, I'd say the biggest difference between discrete and continuous time is, in general, is that continuous time is always about derivatives and discrete time is always about expectations. So the main difference is in how you're going to think about trying to calculate expectations, which is some kind of simulation or Monte Carlo, versus how you're going to try to approximate derivatives to get these differential equations out. To me, that's always the main difference between discrete and continuous time methods. The same is also true with neural networks. So I'd say the big challenge with the continuous time is how do you work out what to do with all these derivatives you're going to have to take. I think that's in general a difference, and I think it's also true for the neural networks as well. Okay. All right. So we can get first order conditions. So I get my first order condition for my consumption. I get my first order condition for my portfolio choice. And I get my Euler equation. So this is the derivative of my HJB. Taking this derivative with respect to A, I get my Euler equation for xi. Okay. All right. So the final thing we have to think about is which variables would we use in all of this to be represented by the neural network. I think a good rule of thumb is you want to choose variables to represent that it's relatively easy for the neural network to learn. And I think relatively easy tends to mean that they're smooth and bounded functions. So in this case, we choose to approximate the consumption to wealth ratio. It's relatively stable, doesn't tend to explode. And we tend to approximate the volatilities. Okay? So they're the things we approximate. We then need to think about what the loss function would be. Okay? So we need to train these neural networks, the neural network that fits the consumption to wealth ratio and the neural network for the volatilities. We need to find a loss function we want to minimize to try to find the right value. And the right loss functions here are going to be the Euler equation. That's for the xi, right? And my consistency equation for my volatility sigma. Okay? So they will be my loss functions, right? One loss function is my Euler equation, or my derivative of my HJB equation. And the other one is this consistency for sigma. I also need to impose all the other equilibrium conditions, but I can impose them analytically. And so I'm going to get an algorithm that looks like this, right? So I initialize some guess for the neural networks to represent the consumption to wealth ratio and the volatility. I'm going to call the parameters of that this capital theta for the first one, capital theta q for the second one. Then we run this loop. So for each part of the loop, we generate new training points, z, k, eta, right? So we sample from the state space. And then at the sample point, and given our current guess of the parametric forms for omega hat and sigma hat, we're going to calculate the equilibrium at that training point. So we can compute we take our omegas, we can compute the omega for each agent in the population, we can compute the prices, we can get the portfolios, the volatilities, and we can get the drifts, right? So we step through and we calculate the equilibrium. Once we've calculated the equilibrium, we can calculate our loss in the Euler equation, our loss in the consistency equation. then we update our parameters for our neural networks to try to minimize this loss. Okay? So we guess a functional form. Given the current guess of the functional form, we sample a whole lot of points, calculate equilibrium at those points, calculate our losses, and then try to update. Okay? So general approach. Yes?
And good tricks on how to initialize this state space from which you're sampling the points, because you might guess incorrectly where to put the grids for Z, capital, etc.
I think, yeah, a lot of time has gone into trying to think about the right way to sample, particularly from the distribution, right? So when it comes to Z and K, it's not so complicated. In some sense, you can kind of think about what this grid would look like. The sampling difficulty normally comes from the distribution, and actually the paper that sort of compares these different ways of approximating them also thinks about a whole lot of different ways of sampling, right? One way you could sample is to say I'm going to move a few key moments around, and then given those moments, fan out the distribution. That will work very well when the Crusoe-Smith technique works well. Another option that worked really well for the search and matching environment, and actually worked pretty well for discrete state space methods in general, is to solve the economy for a whole collection of aggregate states, right? So you've got a TFP, pick a whole bunch of TFPs, find the steady state at those different Z's. Then do random mixtures or random perturbed mixtures of those different steady states and take that as a starting point to sample. Because you know those distributions are going to be somewhere close to the mark. And then once you kind of start to get it working, right? So you sample from those random mixtures, you get an idea. Then once it starts to converge, you can then take your solution, simulate the economy, and use those simulated paths to further refine where you should search. And I'd say that tends to be the most robust way to do it, right? Use some knowledge of the steady state to start the sampling, learn on it, and then simulate to try to get it to be finer. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, I guess I'm kind of...
Maybe skip the break.
I don't need everyone shouting at me.
We will have a longer break than after Alex's presentation. Otherwise, because we have to go down.
All right, I'll close with this comment. I'll close with this comment here. Okay. So let's think about the evolution of inequality. Okay. So let's start getting back to some of these economic questions. So we've got all this machinery. We can now solve these high-dimensional macrofinance problems. We've got a distribution. We've got asset pricing. We've got complicated optimization problems, right? We can solve it. Let's start to think about how we can relate all that to the way inequality evolves. So here what I've put up is I've put the drift in the wealth share between some arbitrary agent J and some arbitrary agent I in the economy. Okay. What determines the way that the wealth share of different agents is either converging or drifting apart? And we can see this has a few key terms. The red term says the agents might have different portfolios in capital. And this is the return on capital. So if capital is earning a higher return than other assets in the economy, and the wealthier agents are holding more capital, that means that the inequality is going to start to expand. Right? On the other hand, we might have different consumptions. These are the consumption to wealth ratios for the different agents. So if the wealthier agents consume more, then the distribution will come back together. And here is the redistribution from the tax scheme. So we can see how these different components are going to dictate what this distribution looks like. And I think the nice thing about this environment that gets played out even more in the model with the different types of intermediaries is here it's really the asset pricing that's going to determine what this fat tail looks like, right? With a lot of models we have completely exogenous idiosyncratic risk that's going to pin down the fat tail. Here it's not the case. Here, to the extent there is a fat tail, it comes from the fact that there is endogenous asset pricing, and in this endogenous asset pricing there are agents that have different ability to access it, and wealthier agents are potentially able to get wealthier because they've got better investment opportunities, or not, right? And so here the risk premia in the economy are going to determine a lot what the distribution ends up looking like, and particularly the extent to which there's a fat tail in this economy.
Because like without aggregate shock, right, like you could have perfectly like light tail distribution as those guys are just dying off. Or would it be even just a mass? No, it wouldn't be a mass.
We'll take this up in the break. And so here's one result. So here we can see different levels of the participation constraint. So we change the severity of how difficult it is for households to participate. So here we've got their holdings in capital, right? Blue is they're holding in, this is when there's a light participation constraint. Green is the heaviest one. So here is the fraction of their wealth in capital stock. We can see that depending on how much the households can participate, we get very different risk premia in the economy. And as a result, the way that the evolution evolves is also very different. The economies with the explosive risk premia, where it's hard to have participation, they're the ones where the inequality can explode as the experts get poor and the risk premia goes up. Okay, so we see this connection. And I'll leave it there, Marcus. Yeah. Okay, you can take a look at our asset price. What?
Just tell us how to pronounce the HIAP.
So the HIAP model, that's the one with the different types of intermediaries. As you can imagine, if you think about this, now we're going to have both banks and pension insurance funds, but different agents have different exposures to the different sectors. Because now we don't just care about the risk premia, we care about where the risk premia sits. Does it sit in the capital sector, or does it sit to do with the fee that sits on pension annuity products? And so where that sits is going to determine who wins and who loses from the various changes. But I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.